So what's the highlight? What is Fieldtrip Ventures up to? What are you building?
Yeah, we're looking to build the first vertically integrated business in legal psychedelics. So coming from the big cannabis sector, our last business we sold to Aurora Cannabis and spent a couple of years helping that business grow. And we saw that the successful cannabis companies are the ones that have integrated broadly across a number of sectors. And so that's exactly what we're planning to do.
Now walk us through your background a little bit, because you're building Fieldtrip Ventures. Obviously, prior to this, you have a successful entrepreneurial career in the cannabis industry and specifically beverages. What have you learned from that career that you're bringing into it? Maybe talk about that business a little bit, just to give people a sense of where you're coming from.
Sure, yeah. So our last business, it was two sister companies. One was Cannabis RX and one was Canadian Cannabis Clinics. The latter has grown to be the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics in Canada. We have 35 locations across Canada and helped about 100,000 Canadians access legal cannabis for medical purposes. Cannabis RX, which was the sister company and really the commercialization engine, was sold to Aurora. And we spent a couple of years with Aurora, but the real success was on the Canadian Cannabis Clinic side, because we really built a lot of the trust and engendered great relationships with the medical community in Canada. And I think that was actually one of the fundamental things to breaking down a lot of the barriers of accessing cannabis, was once you get the medical community actively on board supporting the therapeutic applications, that's when people started flooding into the system. It became accessible to more and more Canadians, and we really want to take that approach and replicate it for psychedelics, which is, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of lack of understanding, and bringing the medical community and medical professionals on board to the emerging field is going to be essential.
Yeah, because this is not unfamiliar territory for you to be a pioneer in a legal or criminalized industry. And why now? Why would you transition now from cannabis into the psilocybin or psychedelic world?
There's a couple of reasons. One is the need is urgent. If anyone here has read Michael Pollan's book, I think he says it quite eloquently, which is, the pharmacological pipeline is drying up and there's no new medications or alternatives for mental health treatment these days. And psychedelics present an amazing and not new, re-emerging opportunity to treat and fundamentally address many of the underlying morbidities associated with mental health. It's quite mind-blowing, and because cannabis has, I think, really broken down a lot of the barriers and changed the stigma and changed the dialogue, and it opens people's minds to alternative treatments and alternative therapies, it just made sense as we wound down with Aurora and we're looking for new opportunities, and saw the parallels between psychedelics and cannabis in terms of harm profile, in terms of the acceptance of its therapeutic value. It just made sense to get started on it, and the need is now.
Yeah, and you referenced Pollan's book, and when you walk forward 10, 20 years, do you think you'll look back, was that the spark that changed the tide in public interest and made people more welcome to accepting this industry?
Yeah, certainly I think so. It was the first really broad-based, approachable, credible from a more acceptable source. I mean, Michael Pollan's reputation is well established. He has advanced important dialogues, and interestingly, in speaking with him, he's really opened up psychedelics to an older population. There's a lot of older people who are interested in psychedelics because of what he's done. So it's not, I think cannabis probably came from a much more grassroots and younger demographic, but because Michael Pollan's in his 60s, he went through this experience, he was very candid about it. I think, the movement towards psychedelics is coming from a different audience, actually.
Yeah, and a very credible journalist, right? And one thing he pointed out, I think, in his book, or maybe he just talked about it in interviews following, was the role that media plays. And he placed a lot of blame on media, demonizing this industry in the 70s, and he's calling out to media now to reverse that. Okay, so back to Fieldtrip Ventures. You've got some exciting things happening in Jamaica. You want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. So last week we announced a strategic partnership with the University of West Indies in Jamaica to build the world's first legal cultivation and research center for psilocybin mushrooms. And so when it comes to psilocybin mushrooms, it's not like where cannabis is now. There's so much work that needs to be done in terms of understanding, the genetics, the strains, the cultivation techniques, the extractions, the formulations, as well as just exploring mushrooms for novel molecules. I mean, there's psilocybin and psilocin, which most people are familiar with, but there's other alkaloids in cubensis, which is what we typically associate with magic mushrooms, like baeocystin or norbaeocystin, and there's roughly 200 other psychoactive producing fungi in the world that haven't been explored in depth. So there's a whole bunch of opportunity to do some really good work in terms of building the infrastructure to support a future market for psilocybin mushrooms as opposed to synthetic psilocybin, as well as new drugs and new discoveries.
So can we dive into that facility a little bit? In terms of the timeline, where are you at? You secured the facility. You are right now in R&D. Are you actually producing? What are you guys up to?
Yeah, no, we have space secured on the University of West Indies Mona campus. Construction starts imminently. We're building it in a modular way, so construction will be extremely fast. We expect to be operating by the end of this year. We have our own researchers, but the agreement we have with the University of West Indies, which is fantastic for us and for them, is they're giving us access to some of their best researchers as well. So we're getting an already well-recognized roster of researchers to move this really quickly, as well as bringing on our own researchers who come from cannabis, as well as mycology. And so we've got a great team, really exciting stuff.
And what's happening with the products? Once you guys are producing, are you moving into R&D studying the compounds? Are you moving towards clinical trials? What's next?
Yeah, all of it. So, we're going to start by just establishing the methods and standards for testing psilocybin-producing mushrooms because they don't exist. And from there, we'll look at novel molecules. We'll look at cultivation techniques. We'll look at all the different genetics that exist. Like it's going to be a multi-tiered approach to this work.
And is all of this going to occur, and is it going to have to occur in Jamaica, or are you going to be engaging in clinical trials elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, we do eventually plan to do our own clinical trials. We don't have immediate plans for them. A lot of the clinical trial work we anticipate doing is going to come from the research, but in North America, we're in the process of setting up 5 flagship psychedelic specialized medical clinics that'll be based in Toronto, New York, LA, like the large metropolitan centers, because right now what you need is, even anticipating a legal market, even if it happened today, you don't have the infrastructure to support it, as Dennis spoke about. This is done, psychedelics and psychedelic medicine is provided in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. It's not like you can go to your doctor's office and expect them to administer psilocybin and let you have a psychedelic session for 4 hours in their office. In the same token, psychotherapists and psychiatrists are very well equipped to provide this kind of care, but they tend to be owner-operated sole proprietorship, which doesn't lend itself to scaling. And so a whole new clinic model needs to be built, and leveraging our experience from Canadian cannabis clinics, we have a good line on what we think that needs to look like in a way that can be delivered cost-effectively, efficiently, and really to help a lot of people.
Okay, and what are the indications or indicators that you think should be proven out first? And a lot of our companies here are focused on depression and addiction because it seems like low-hanging fruit. Is that what you're focused on?
We're agnostic. Truthfully, we don't care if it comes for depression, anxiety, anorexia, whatever. It doesn't matter to us. Obviously, we think all of these are important, but we're evidence-based. What made us succeed with Canadian cannabis clinics was being prudent, engendering trust with the medical community, and we did that by following the science and following the evidence. And so where the evidence goes, we'll follow, and we'll let it happen. Certainly, given the prevalence of anxiety, PTSD, and depression in society, it's really important that these conditions get treated. But from our business perspective, we're largely indifferent.
So what does the perfect legalization picture look like for you? Is it total free market, recreational access? Is it strictly clinical? What's the best case scenario that we could hope for a long-standing market?
I think the approach has to be prudent, which is I think you got to start with a medical system that is done prudently and thoughtfully with the oversight of medical practitioners. I hear Dennis's point that this is something that should be accessible to all, but I think we need to be thoughtful and doing it in a medical context with oversight with people who are professional is a good place to start. It's a way to build evidence. It's a way to show that if you introduce these molecules, much like with cannabis, the sky is not going to fall. Society is not going to change for the worse. It's going to change for the better. And start with the medical system, show that it's safe, show that it's effective, and go from there and learn from it. So again, we're pretty agnostic. I don't have a best case scenario other than it should be accessible. And as long as it's helping people, then we'll continue to move forward.
Okay, now what's a black swan event that could push the needle backwards? Right now we're surging forwards. There's a ton of hype and public interest and cash flowing to this industry. Lots of entrepreneurs are launching new businesses. But what could push us all backwards and push us back into call it a 1970s worldwide condemnation effect?
I don't think that's a likely outcome. I think the worst case scenario is that you'll see things like decriminalization in Oakland and Denver, which I think is actually very progressive and a positive step forward. But when you open up markets without regulations, people take it as tacit approval to indulge. And so if you don't have a regulated supply chain like Dennis was talking about, then you risk scenarios where people are overdoing it or getting access to bad product. And as you kind of pointed out about media considerations, it could make a delicious story for a reporter to talk about how someone had a terrible experience on psychedelics, and that can shift the tide, at least politically. But my sense is that having gone through cannabis, having seen that by and large, even though there's been some negative instances, it's been a positive experience. I think you'll get a lot of political support, and because the evidence in support of using psychedelics for therapeutic purposes is so strong, much stronger than it ever has been for cannabis, I think I don't think there's a black swan event that sets us back. There may be things that slow it down or make the dialogue become a little bit more challenging, but I think this is a train that's left the station, and there's no real stopping it at this point.
So for those people who aren't sure yet if this is a good idea, they've believed in the narrative that we've been sold for the last 30 years that psychedelics are bad, have no medicinal use, should be outlawed, full stop. Where's a good place to start if someone's curious about becoming more educated about the space, or maybe you want to encourage somebody in your life to become more educated about the space? Where would you point them? Some introductory content.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of great resources right now. I think Michael Pollan's book is probably the most honest, so that's where I'd point everybody. A little shill for Michael there, but I think it's a really honest, open, candid, fairly objective look at psychedelics and their uses and their limitations and what people can expect. And he provides more than enough references to further reading if you want to delve further. But there's also materials on the Johns Hopkins website, Imperial College. So anyone who wants to look can find pretty objective materials to find.
And what about you guys? Once you're operating in Jamaica, will you be publishing your studies for the public to read, or what will you be offering any content like that?
That's a good question. I have no idea. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Obviously, as a business and for-profit, we have to focus on shareholder returns. We're a very conscientious operator. We're not profits above all. And we believe in open science to some degree, but we also have shareholders to worry about. So we'll disclose what we think advances a dialogue, but ensures that our intellectual property is sufficiently protected.
Okay, now if you're fairly confident that we couldn't have any sort of black swan event that would push us back, what went wrong then? Coming out of the 60s, we saw the same. We call this feature the psychedelic renaissance because we've seen this rodeo before. Right, but last time it didn't end so well for the industry. So what went wrong?
Richard Nixon. Listen. I think with any sort of cataclysmic shift in societal values, there's going to be a pushback. I think if you look at the time and era of the '60s, there was a huge generational change that a lot of people weren't comfortable with. Right now, though, there isn't that such a large, stark shift. My mom is a medical cannabis user. My mom is open to using psychedelics. My mom had never used cannabis in her life before I got in the industry, right? There's just a different mindset. Whereas I think when you look at the previous generation, it was a much, much more precipitous change from one generation to the next. So I think that's what happened. And, I even got Donald Trump talking about encouraging people and veterans to use esketamine, which is not a psychedelic per se, but it does operate in many of the same overarching themes as psychedelics. So I don't see it as a likely circumstance where something like that happens.
Okay. Now, for anybody who wants to know more about Fieldtrip Ventures, I know you guys you're on the show floor, so we can run by your booth and chat to your team. And outside of the conference, where can we find you and more information about Fieldtrip?
Yeah, so visit us at fieldtriphealth.com. It's the best place to find us. Or you can find me, I'm all over the internet. I've been very active in the cannabis space. So if you just Google my name, you can probably track me down as well. My business partner, Ryan, is at the back there, I think. And you can track him down as well, and we'd be happy to chat with you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ronan. Please give him a hand.